Hey, hello everyone. Hello again. Welcome to everyone who's joined us. And welcome to this month's doctoral seminar featuring Rebecca Rohloff Barria. My name is Elisa Weingort and I'm your host for tonight. I am a grade 6-7 English Language Arts Social Studies teacher at the Academia Cotopaxi, which is an American international school in Quito, Ecuador. Rebecca is a doctoral student in the Language and Literacy program at Georgia State University. She has experience teaching students from 18 months old to 18 years old in subjects ranging from language arts to computer science. Her research interests include writing development, the intersection of children's play and literacy practices, motivation, and literate identity formation. This is the first time that Rebecca is presenting at our doctoral web seminars, and we look forward to hearing her insights on writing the IRB research protocol. As I said, I'm your host for tonight, and I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Australia in Adelaide, as well as a full-time teacher. Dr. Peggy Albers, who's the Professor of Language and Literacy Education in the College of Education at Georgia State University, will hopefully be joining us soon. She's the founder of the Global Conversations in Doctoral Preparation, as well as Global Conversations in Literacy Research. The Global Conversations in Doctoral Preparation, or GCDP, are mentoring web seminars that are designed by doctoral students for doctoral students. These seminars offer different perspectives on various topics related to the doctoral education experience. We are very excited to have doctoral candidates like Rebecca from Georgia State University, and next month, Nicole Petit and Molly Friesenborg from Georgia State University and the Director of Program at Girls Incorporated, respectively, to share their experiences with us. We welcome doctoral students from across the country, as well as internationally, to present at these web seminars. We hope that these seminars will be extended into global conversations around doctoral preparation, so that we can learn from and with each other. These doctoral web seminars cover a range of topics. They can be about research we're engaged in, some aspect of the doctoral program, or about how to mentor ourselves into the academy. Tonight's presentation by Rebecca, Writing the IRB Research Protocol, is one such mentoring session that will guide us in our academic research and writing. We're using BlackboardCollaborate, and I hope you will become familiar with the tools. Feel free to ask Rebecca any questions by typing in the chat box, and we'll be collecting the questions as we proceed with the seminar. But instead of answering them as we're going along, we'll have a Q&A at the end of Rebecca's presentation. Right now, please share which part of the world you're joining us from. You'll see a toolbar on your left where you can click on the star, drag it, and place it on the map, or if you like, you can type in the chat box. We'll just take a minute or so just to see where everybody's from. Okay, that's great. We've got the U.S., except for me, I'm in Ecuador, but I haven't put my tool in yet. Okay, hopefully we'll have other people join us as we go along. There's someone that did just join us a minute ago. Welcome. Okay, it is now my pleasure to present Rebecca Rohloff Barria. Rebecca Rohloff Barria, as I said earlier, is a doctoral student in the Language and Literacy program at Georgia State University. And again, her research interests include writing development, the intersection of children's play and literacy practices, motivation, and literate identity formation. This evening, Rebecca will be offering insights into the process of writing the IRB research protocol. So it is a great deal of pleasure that I welcome Rebecca on behalf of Global Conversations in Doctoral Preparation. Rebecca, you're on.
Can you hear me? Okay, all right, can everybody hear me? Okay, all right, good, okay. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about the IRB process, and I can't speak as an expert, but I can speak as someone with experience having navigated that process recently. So I just want to share a little bit about what the components are of the application and a little bit about that process. Also, as I'm going along, if you want to pause for questions, I'm totally open to that. If you prefer to wait until the very end, that's fine too. But just so you know, if before we move on to the next section, if you want to field some questions, that's fine with me. Okay, so the first thing that you'll need when navigating the IRB process is going to be the manual. And I don't know if the manual will differ from university to university, but this is the link for the one at Georgia State. And the manual has a lot of information in it, and as a qualitative researcher, I didn't actually need quite a bit of it, and also because I'm not doing an intervention, I was doing naturalistic observations. There are a lot of things in there that didn't pertain to me. I'm also not doing like a medical trial or something like that. So it's a very thick document to wade through. But I'm going to try to talk about the most relevant portions of that for the type of research that I'm doing and that I think a lot of you may be doing as well. Okay, so the application that you submit to IRB has a number of components. First of all, you're going to complete, well, first of all, before we start, I'm curious to know how many of y'all have actually completed the IRB process yourself, or how many of y'all have started the process, or how many of y'all maybe are just now beginning that whole process. So if you want to put your answers in the chat box, I'll look at that. I just want an idea of where everybody is in their own personal process. Okay. So it looks like it's fairly split. Okay, well, so the process, the application process, it contains a number of components. And one of the first components is a questionnaire that you fill out actually on the website. And the questions deal with things like, is your project funded? Will your research take place in the U.S. or will it take place out of the U.S.? Some other components that you have to include in your application includes a site permission letter. So wherever you plan to conduct your observations or wherever you plan to be collecting your data, you're going to need permission from that organization or that institution. I did research in a preschool, so before I started my research, I had to secure permission, and you have to do that with your application. If you don't have permission, you're not going to get approved. So I had a simple letter drafted by the director of the preschool that said I have permission to come into the preschool, and she named the campus that I would be at since there were multiple campuses, and also specified the duration of the study. She left it pretty open, which was fine, but it's important that the letter have some of these components, like your name, for example, and the name of the institution. Another thing that you have to include in your application is your research protocol, and your research protocol is what I will spend most of the time talking about because it's a rather lengthy document. There's a lot to it. And if your protocol isn't worded quite right, it'll get sent back to you. And I went through the process, I think maybe through probably 3 or 4 revisions, if I remember correctly, and the whole process took me probably about 3 months. And each time it was tended to be some sort of issue I had with my protocol or an inconsistency. So if when you create your protocol and you then answer the questionnaire, you want to make sure your answers correspond almost verbatim. So you also need to include a letter for your participants, quite possibly. In my study, I am observing preschool students in their classroom with their teachers. I'm also doing some informal interviews with the kids just as they're working. They're 3 and 4, they're between 2 and 4. So I'm not actually pulling these kids out for formal interviews. I'm doing casual interviews. I am doing formal interviews with the teachers and also with some of the parents. So I needed to have a letter in order for my IRB application to be approved, a letter for the parents, a letter for the teachers. And the letter for the parents, I needed to explain who I was, why I was in the school, what I hoped to get out of this study, how I would be observing the students, or and how I might want to also interact with the parents, which for me was the form of an interview. So I had to lay everything out, also specify the duration of my study, and put just a little bit of information about privacy. So in addition to an information letter, I also had to include some various forms. And especially if you're working with children, it's important to understand the distinctions between these forms. So for adults sign an informed consent saying that they understand what the study's about, they understand their rights, and they sign them for themselves. Now, if you're working with minors, you have to get a parental permission form. So the parents will sign the form on behalf of their children saying that, yes, they give permission to me to include their children in the study. Now, what's important, though, is that even if a parent gives permission to their child, gives permission for their child to participate in the study, the child can actually choose not to. So even though mom said, yes, you can participate, I can't actually force any child to participate. They can decide that they don't want to participate. And so that's something else that you have to keep in mind. And I actually, in one of my revisions, had to include language pertaining to that in my consent form, so that parents understood that their child will not be forced, even if even if they think it's a great idea. Another thing to keep in mind is that children over the age of 6 have to assent. So that's what I was talking about. The child can say, no, I don't want to participate. Even though they can't sign the form, they can say to me that they don't want to participate. Also, for the children under 6 years old, they don't have to give assent because a lot of the kids that I work with aren't fully verbal yet. They're just not developmentally there. But I had to include quite a bit of information in my consent and permission forms to specify how, and also in my application, how I would determine whether or not I should continue working with this child. So I had to talk a lot about the toddler's body language. So if a child was resisting me in any way, then I would have to terminate my observation of them or my interview of them. So that was something that I didn't include in my original application, but I had to go back and revise. So if you're working with young children, that's something to keep in mind. And then the last thing that I had included in my application were some sample interview questions. So I conducted some semi-structured interviews with a lot of open-ended questions. So I still, however, had to include some sample questions that I would ask the parents and the teachers and the students. So I had to include 3 different sets. Okay, is there any questions or anything at this point before I move on?
Rebecca, one question that came through in the chat box that was really good and we have seen come up before. If a person is planning on presenting at a conference, so perhaps presenting some empirical evidence that they had gathered and analyzed, but they do not plan to publish it, do you know if they would have to apply for an IRB?
So my understanding is yes. My understanding is that if you collect data for a class assignment, you don't have to have IRB, but you can't use that data for any sort of presentation outside of the classroom or any sort of publication. I know that there are some nuances there if you're writing a practitioner piece as opposed to a research piece. I haven't done that myself, so that's a gray area that I haven't really explored more deeply. But the question that you asked, I would say no, you can't use that data for a presentation. You need to get IRB approval. And if anybody, you know, and also, like, if anybody has had experience otherwise or has heard something different otherwise, feel free to, you know, write that in the chat box, because I definitely don't claim to be any sort of final authority.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, and we'll continue forward with your presentation. And as more questions arise, we will get to those as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so another thing, okay, so I wanted to go through the different components of the application. And so I've created some slides to kind of walk through what each of these items, some of the tips that I've picked up along the way, or some of the components that I figured out that I needed to include. So the site letter, you want to make sure that when you have someone draft this letter for you, and for some of you, if you're trying to work with a school system or some larger organization, getting this letter might be quite an ordeal. So when you have this letter drafted, you want to make sure you got all of the necessary information included in it the first time, because going back and asking for a revision might be difficult. So you want to make sure that you include a lot of just the basic information, like your name and your affiliation with Georgia State, and the site name and the location, because like, for example, the preschool that I did my study at has 2 campuses, and I was going to be working exclusively on one campus. However, she worded the letter so that way if at some point if a kid transferred to the other campus or something like that, I would have that flexibility to follow the child over there. So although I was at one campus, she did include language, so that way it was clear where I was allowed to be. Also, you want to include your dates of the study, and in my case, she was more open on the dates than my actual application. So that was nice, because when I did extend my application, I didn't have to get a new letter because my letter already included the dates of the study. You also want to include, make sure that the person who's signing this letter is someone official. And in my case, I had the director of the preschool sign my letter. Okay, so the research protocol is rather lengthy, and I'm actually going to break down the protocol for us. I have a few slides to let you know a little bit more about what each section should include. And so the protocol includes several basic things. One being the title, a brief summary, your rationale or your purpose, your objectives. Objectives is more of a quantity term, so maybe for qual work we want to say something like your research questions, your methodology, your data management and analysis, ethical considerations, and then your references. So in your application, when you cite literature and former studies, or you cite you're citing your methodology, you'll actually include a reference list. So just keep that in mind, that you still are documenting your sources. Oops. Okay. Okay. So I've been reading one of Cresswell's books. The title of it is. I've been reading Research Design, and it's qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method approaches. And there's been a lot of helpful information in that textbook. One of the things is the idea of a title. I never gave my title very much thought at the beginning, and now it's something I think more about. So your title of your research study, think of it as an orienting device. Think of it as something that's going to guide your study, something that's brief and succinct. So you want to be really concise. And the recommendation that I often hear is to have 12 words or less. And that actually is something I've heard with publications in journals as well, that for some reason 12, having less than a dozen words is that magic threshold. So you want a brief title. You want to eliminate all of the unnecessary words like articles and prepositions. So that way you really pare it down to, you really take away all the extraneous things so that you can really focus on your study topic. You also want to use simple language. You know, the title is, especially at this stage when you're writing your IRB and you're not actually creating a title for an article, your title really is your guide and really should be for you. So all of the fancy terminology you probably don't need to try to pack into this title. Just think of this as a simple, concise statement that will help guide your research. And it's so easy to veer off into different paths, but your title can be a quick glance that brings you back. So my title that I used in my study was How Preschoolers Enact Their Identities Through Writing. And I put 4 bullets here. I've presented at 4 different conferences on some of the data that I've collected, and if you skim through my titles, you can see how my original study title has morphed depending on how I've analyzed the data. But when you look at these subtitles, these titles that I used at various conferences, you can still see how my broad study title, all these things fit under that umbrella. So it is something that guides me quite well. So your summary, my summary was a paragraph. That's what I included in my IRB protocol. It's really not, it's a bit like an abstract, but for your IRB. So I included my research questions and my sub-questions. I specified the location that it was a preschool. I specified the activity, so what sort of things I would be doing. I also specified my data collection tools, and so I did things like participant observation, interviews, classroom maps, video recordings, audio recordings, and artifacts, children's work that they produced. I also specified my participants, and I didn't go into great detail about them, but I specified that I would be working with a group of preschoolers and their teachers in their classroom on a preschool campus, and that I would also be interviewing their parents. Then I also specified the duration of the study. So I specified the date, the time frame in which I would be gathering data. So really this part should be just a nice strong paragraph. Now the rationale, this is why you're doing this study and what it is you hope to get out of it. So the components of a rationale include a literature review, your purpose statement, and your research questions. So you can see that there's some repetition, like the summary included the research questions as well. So one of the things to think about as you're drafting your IRB application is that if you change the wording of your research question in your rationale, make sure that you have also changed the wording in every other place, including the question, the application, the questionnaire, and the summary and the rationale. Because if there's any inconsistencies, then your application may be returned for revisions, and that'll just slow down your process. And I can speak to that from experience. So for your rationale, here are a number of tips that I've picked up along the way. A lot of these came from the Cresswell book that I mentioned earlier, his research book. So you want to focus on one idea, and that's one of my personal weaknesses. Or, I mean, maybe it's a strength in some contexts, but when I'm trying to draft the IRB protocol, I really had to think about what it is I wanted to study, and I had to focus in on one idea. And I had several ideas, several related ideas, but the project was going to be too gigantic and really impossible to ever do. So I had to focus on one idea. And when I drafted my rationale, I used action verbs. And so for qual work, that's words like understand, explore, examine. And so using action verbs and eliminating the passive verbs, it really helped, for me personally, helped shape just what it is I wanted to do with this study. Also avoiding any sort of loaded words. So you want to use a lot of neutral words. So you don't want to imply that for example, I wanted to look at how children experience writing in a preschool classroom. So I needed to avoid like a positive writing experience or negatively impact. So I had to keep things neutral. Also defining the terms. If you use a term, at some point you need to define it. You want to also talk about your methodology. Are you doing an ethnography, a case study, a phenomenology, that sort of thing? Also, you want to describe your participants in the rationale and, who are these kids, who are, well, in my case, they were kids and teachers and parents. Things like the potential age range, what their role is in the setting, perhaps, and any other important information about them. Also, you want to list again the site where your study is taking place and the scope of the study, and then the duration, like how long do you anticipate collecting data, for example. Okay, so objectives is more of a quant word to me. It has more of a quant connotation. So for this portion of the protocol, I really think of this as my research questions. And I included, I specified that I was doing qualitative work, and I used open-ended questions for my research questions. And then and it was one central question that I developed, and then I developed 3 additional sub-questions. But when you're writing your own, you want to you don't want to ask more than maybe 5 sub-questions. You also want to connect your questions to your methodology. So if you're doing an ethnography, then your question should somehow reflect culture, whether you're trying to define a culture or understand a culture or explore a particular culture. In my case, my methodology was mediated discourse analysis. So my research questions had to do quite a bit with the discourse that takes place in the classroom. And since I was using mediated discourse analysis, which looks not just only at verbal language, but also body language, I also included that in my research questions as well. I also talked about multimodal writing as well. And then the last thing you want to do in your research question is to identify your participants. So in my case, I'm very interested, my primary participants are the children. I want to understand how they experience multimodal writing in a preschool classroom. But my sub-questions included questions related to like the teacher-student discourse and things like that takes place. And then, some qual terms would be like explore, understand, describe, discover, examine. In my case, I was examining how children experience writing, or trying to understand how they experience writing. Do we have any questions or anything before I move on?
I think, Rebecca, at this point, we'll let you go ahead and move on, and then we will take a few questions at the very end.
Okay. Okay, so I'll talk for probably another 15 minutes, and then we can take some questions, unless you want me to move a little faster than that.
No, I think that sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so you want to include methodology in your protocol. So again, you want to include your site information. So for me, I included the fact that this would be taking place in a classroom, in a preschool, in an urban setting. I talked about my participants, and in this section, you're going to talk more deeply about your participants, and some of the things that you would need to address would be, for example, their age, what their role is in the context, but also any recruitment procedures or screening procedures or exclusion criteria. So if you were looking at, so for me, I didn't have any exclusion criteria or screening procedures. I was open to looking at the experiences of every child in the classroom. In some studies, it's possible that you perhaps would only be wanting to look at a particular population. So if you were, there were some students in the class who were foreign language or English, I shouldn't say foreign language. English is a second language. They spoke a different language in their home. So perhaps if I wanted to study them, my exclusion criteria or my screening procedures would have to speak to the fact that I was looking for students who spoke a different language in their home. And then I would have to define how I would determine that. I had another study that I did in another class. It was a class study, and it had to do with the experience of being a fisherman. And in that particular one, I had to define fisherman. What is a fisherman? And how do I identify fishermen? And in this particular case, I would accept anybody who self-identified as a fisherman if they said they were a fisherman and that was part of their identity that they claimed. So those are the sorts of things that you might need to talk about when you're discussing your participants. So you'd go into more depth here. You have to talk quite a bit about your data. So you want to talk about your sources of data. So for my study, I used interviews with parents, teachers, and students, and I had to talk about the type of interview. I was doing semi-structured, open-ended questions. but if you had a script that you were sticking to, you would want to specify that. I also talked about participant observation and what my role would be in the classroom. I actually taught at this school. I'm a former teacher at the school where I collected my data. So for me to be in the classroom and to slip into a teacher-like role at various points was very natural and easy for me, and the culture of the school accepted that. So I had to talk a little bit about my role, my anticipated role in the study, and how I would handle that. I also talked about the artifacts that I would collect from the children, the fact that I would make maps of the classroom, because one component of my study that I was interested in was focusing on literacy events that take place in the classroom. So for me, I was interested in where these different literacy events took place. Was there a particular table set up with different items that the kids would go to and then have these engaging interactions? So those are the things you talk about in data. You talk about the site, the location. In this case, I talked a good bit about the classroom. You also talk about your data and privacy. So how I would maintain privacy, for example, with the interviews. So I had to specify a location within the school that I could take the teachers and interview them privately. In this case, I interviewed the teachers in their classrooms at the end of the day after everyone was gone, but I had to specify in there how I would maintain that. Also, you have to talk about participant involvement, how they're involved in your study, and then your time frame as well. So another component of methodology is your framework. Are you doing a qual or a quant study? In my case, I was situating this in a sociolinguistic frame, so I talked a little bit about that. And then my tools of analysis is mediated discourse analysis. So I talked about what is mediated discourse analysis and why was I using that particular tool of analysis for my data. And now you don't have, I mean, I think my whole methodology section was maybe 700 words, give or take. I would say between 500 and 900 words. Yours might be longer, might be shorter, but just to give you an idea. So you also need to talk about your data management and analysis. And one of the things that I had my study sent back a couple different times for revisions, and one of the things that I recall having to address is the security of my data, how I would manage all this data. And in my particular case, I used a lot of pseudonyms. I used pseudonyms for all of my children. All the participants actually, including the teachers and the parents. So I had to specify where I would keep my key. Since if you find the key, then you can identify everyone in my study. So whether you keep it on a firewall protected computer, in a cloud with password protected, whether you keep it in a file cabinet in your home office that's locked, wherever you store your data, you actually have to address pretty specifically in your application. And then, of course, you talk about your analysis, which I spoke about briefly on the prior slide. So another really important part of the IRB application is the ethical considerations, and this is where I had to spend a lot of time reworking my application. Well, not a lot of time, but some of the feedback I got from during the submission process had to do with being explicit about some of these ethical considerations. So when you're recruiting participants, there are some pretty important rules that you have to follow. For example, I had to specify that when I approached the teachers that they would not be influenced by the directors of the school to participate, that they would not feel that it was an obligation to participate. Even though the directors were fully supportive and excited about this, a teacher may not be excited about me coming into their classroom. And so I had to really specify how I would recruit these teachers. And I had to include wording and language in my application to say that when I met with the teachers, I met with the teachers before school one morning, and the director just sent an email saying that I would be on campus. It was my information letter. She sent that out, who I am, what I'm interested in doing, and that if they were interested, they could come meet with me where my location would be. And I had to specify to her that when I'm talking to the teacher, she's not allowed in the room because there can't be any impression that she's paying attention to who is or is not interested, or for there to be any kind of influence like that. Also, I had to talk about how would I disperse these forms. I didn't want the director to give the forms out, the consent forms, to the teachers with there being any sort of suggestion, implicit suggestion that the director is giving you this form, therefore you better sign it. So I gave all the forms to the teachers who were interested, and I also allowed them to submit their forms in an envelope. I tacked up an envelope on a bulletin board inside the office, so it was a secure area, but it was an area that the director wasn't always there. It was more of a workroom area, and so they could anonymously slip it in. So who did or didn't submit their forms, nobody would know. So these are things that you have to really think about. The IRB really cares about these things. So when you're writing your application, think through that. You know, how will you recruit your participants and deal with any potential ethical concerns. Also, for data collection, since I was working with young children, I had my application returned to me with feedback on having to include more language on how I would be checking in with these kids to determine whether or not they really wanted to participate. And even with the adults, an adult may not come right out and say that they don't want to participate anymore. They may feel uncomfortable withdrawing themselves from the study. So I had to include some language in there specifying how I would basically check in with people from time to time and allow them that opportunity to back out if they felt the need to. I had to talk about with the kids, the young children who I would be interviewing, since they were so little. I talked about how I would build rapport, how I would be in the classroom in a participant observer role, and which meant that I was not just observing them, but also participating limited-wise in a sort of teacher capacity, and building a rapport with all of the children before I started interviewing them. So that was something I had to address. I also had to address the fact that a lot of my children that I interviewed were not fully verbal. So even though I would interact with them on some level, or I would listen to how they interacted with the other children, they were not fully able to articulate their feelings and discomfort sometimes. So even if they could answer some of my questions, if they were uncomfortable, that might manifest through their body language or their gestures. So I actually included language in my IRB protocol about that as well. So your consent and permission and assent forms. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to briefly recap, the adults sign informed consent forms. The parents sign permission forms for minors to participate. And then children over the age of 6, they have to give their assent, even though they don't sign a form. So these forms, you can find them on our Georgia State website, the IRB website. There is a template that you can use for these forms, and you have to tweak it according to who your participants are. But you have to include the purpose of your study. Why are you doing this study? What is it you're going to be doing? And on the form, this might be 3 sentences. So it's not going to be the 500 words that you included in your application. This is a brief summary for your participants to read. So your purpose, the procedures, the potential risks to them, the potential benefits, and don't overstate your benefits because that'll be sent back to you. In my case, I had to say that there was no salient benefits for my participants. You also have to specify that participation is totally voluntary and that they can withdraw at any time for any reason. I also had to specify my procedures for confidentiality so that they could guarantee that their information would be kept private, and then also contact information for both myself and, if they had a problem with me, alternative people who they could contact later on if they had any complaints to file or to report. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has any questions for me that or anything that they want to share from their experience. Any feedback?
Sorry to interrupt you, Rebecca. Before we go into that, I just want to thank you very much for your presentation. There are definitely questions from the audience that Jennifer's been collecting throughout your presentation. So we'll go straight to that part of the presentation right now.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. One of the participants in the audience asked, do we have to go through the IRB if we were collecting data outside of the United States? And an extension discussion off of that question was, if you are a student or working at a certain university and you go through your IRB process, however, you're collecting data perhaps at a different university or site, do you also have to go through that university's IRB process?
So my understanding, I can't speak definitively as an authority, but my understanding is that if you are collecting data in another country, you still have to complete the IRB process for the university that you're affiliated with. And since I'm a Georgia State student, no matter where I'm collecting data, I still have to get approval from the IRB here at my university to do any kind of work. And that would include work at another university as well. Now, I don't think that you have to have IRB approval at another university because that would be your site. That's not your affiliation. But I don't know. Maybe there are some different rules about that I'm not aware of. And if anybody knows, please feel free to chime in.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I think a good rule of thumb is when in doubt, do an IRB.
Yeah, exactly. I think pretty much you always have to have an IRB. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, if you don't have IRB approval and then do a lot of work, and then find out that you didn't have, that you needed to have IRB, well, that's data that you can never use because you can't go back retroactively. So when in doubt, submit your application for sure.
Absolutely, and I think that is a fantastic point that you just made, as we're all emerging researchers and certainly need to move through that process pretty often. Another great question that was in the chat box is, can you speak at all to the IRB process when it includes online research? And an example was given is when participants are possibly using a chat, online chat forum, and needing to get consent to use the data that is in the chat. Do you have any experience or knowledge of that process?
No, I don't. And I'm wondering, Tuba's here listening. I'm wondering if maybe any of the GCLR team might actually know more about that. Mhm. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would work because, for example, if you want to, if you're doing research like on the chat here in this platform, I mean, I don't know how that would work if you would have to get consent from people before they participate in the web seminar, or if you don't have to because it's a public venue. So it's like having a conversation in the grocery store and someone observing in a public place. I'm not entirely sure what the rules are around that, but I would be interested to know the answer. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much. I think at this point we are going to go ahead and wrap it up, and I will pass it back over to our moderator.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you everybody for the questions and for your responses, Rebecca. I really appreciated throughout the presentation how you brought in your personal experience, talking about what you had to do and how sometimes you had to go back and change certain things in your IRB. That's very helpful for those of us who still need to do ours. The tips were definitely something that we can all use, so I really appreciate that. And for everyone else, if you could please write something in the chat area about what you learned tonight or anything that you would like to say to Rebecca about her presentation, that would be great. And just want to, again, thank you for participating in the webinar. If you'd like to participate in a 15-minute online interview as part of our GCDP research study, please type in your name and email address in the chat box so we can contact you. And we'd also appreciate if you could take our survey. The link is on the slide, and it can be found on our website as well. This series of, I'll go back here, sorry about that. This series of GCDP webinars is the result of the hard work of a team of doctoral students that are pictured on this slide who are working together to create global conversations among like-minded people. And we'd like to just remind you about upcoming web seminars that are coming up in the next couple of months. We have 3 left for this year. Nicole Petit and Molly Friesenborg from Georgia State University, and they're going to be speaking, and the Director of Programs at Girls Incorporated, respectively, they're going to be speaking about an introduction to community-engaged research. On April 19th, Jennifer Nye, who was curating the questions tonight, Ryan McLeod, I'm hopefully I pronounced that right, and Michael Levicki from Kent State University will be presenting on Meeting in the Middle, the Mixed Methods Paradigm. And on May 17th, our last webinar for the spring, Kim Foster, Kyle Jones, Nick Thompson from Kennesaw State University will be presenting on From the Water Cooler to the Fire Hose, teaching our way through an English education doctorate. So we hope you'll mark these dates on your calendar and, if possible, spread the word through your social networks. And if you'd like to present at GCDP, you may consider inviting friends and colleagues from other universities or from different parts of the world to do a joint presentation with you. And then we'd also like to alert you to upcoming GCLR web seminars, and the upcoming one in March 22nd features Dr. Jim Cummins from the University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, and he's going to be speaking about reversing underachievement, the rocky road from literacy research to policy and practice, and that's at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then Dr. Raul Mora, who actually presented a webinar for GCDP, he's from the Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana in Colombia. He'll be speaking on revisiting today's language ecologies, new questions about language use and literacy practices, and that's at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that is in April. So please mark your calendars. The exact dates you can find on the GCLR website. As we wrap up this evening's seminar, please take a moment to follow us on Facebook, WordPress, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. All the links can be found on our WordPress site, and we hope you'll share this information with your friends and colleagues. And again, thank you everyone for coming tonight. We appreciate your presence and participation, and especially big thanks to Rebecca for presenting tonight, and we look forward to having you next time. Good night.